Now there are two camera modes that I'd recommend sticking to when you're shooting HDR photographs, and each one is going to operate slightly differently, and it's important to understand that difference. If you aren't as comfortable with your camera, then I'd highly recommend shooting in Aperture Priority. When you're shooting in Aperture Priority, basically you're going to set a base ISO. We're always going to use the lowest native possible ISO whenever possible. So let's say we set an ISO of 100. We would then choose our aperture setting, and the camera is going to automatically adjust basically the shutter speed depending on our aperture setting for that median exposure, and then the auto exposure bracketing is going to take care of the rest. But the key important difference in shooting in Aperture Priority is that in Aperture Priority, the exposure is going to be adjusted by the metering mode. Meaning, depending on how the camera's metering is chosen. So if we select spot metering versus evaluative metering versus matrix metering, whatever metering mode that we're selecting, the camera is going to choose the appropriate median exposure for us, and it's going to vary the shutter speed for that median exposure based on that metering mode. This is important because it means that essentially we have a little bit less control when we're shooting in Aperture Priority. But it's a great mode to start out in. Now, if you are more comfortable in shooting with your camera, if you know the settings, and in particular you've shot in manual mode, then I'd highly recommend sticking to shooting in manual mode. This is going to give you better overall results, and we're going to be dialing in basically the ISO the same way, the aperture the same way, only this time you're going to control the shutter speed as well to get to your median exposure. The difference here being that in manual mode, the metering mode that we select is only going to work as a guide, meaning that it's not going to change our exposure for us. It's simply going to act as a guide to help us interpret the information that we see in our scene. So we can use spot metering to set in our exposure value. We can use matrix metering to set in the exposure value, center weighted average, whatever works for you and whatever helps you. You can use that in manual metering or in manual mode to dial in the exact exposure for that median exposure image. Now this is great for several reasons. Number one, shooting in manual mode is going to give you much more consistent images as well as much more control over your scene. I would recommend shooting in manual mode going into a scene using, say, evaluative or whatever metering mode that you prefer. Shoot a single shot and check it out. We're going to check out the histogram, which we'll talk about later on, and we'll show you as we're shooting. Take a look at it and then make exposure value adjustments based on that for the median exposure. At that point, once we've dialed in the median exposure, we let the camera's auto exposure bracketing take care of the rest. And from there on, regardless of whether you're using Aperture Priority or whether you're using manual mode, the auto exposure bracketing will work exactly the same way. So to reiterate, if you're not as comfortable with your camera, feel free to start out in Aperture Priority. It gives you one less thing to really think about. If you are comfortable with your camera, I'd highly recommend using manual mode. And even if you aren't comfortable, wean yourself over to manual mode. You'll get there quickly. You'll be surprised at how easy it is to move and transition into shooting all manual. You'll get better images, more consistent images, and you'll have much more control over your HDR photographs. And let's go on to the next video where we're going to discuss the different metering modes and kind of different scenes that we use each metering mode in.